everyone, welcome to my channel. Welcome to today's video. Today's video is going to be my monthly installment of Would I Repurchase? So that is a monthly series that I do here on my channel where I pick 10 palettes from my eyeshadow collection. They're usually a little bit older. They usually are not talked about anymore. And just talk about if I would repurchase them or not. If I love them, if I don't love them, the formula, etc. It gives me a really good opportunity to just be a little bit more reflective with some eyeshadow palettes that are in my collection. So if that sounds good to you, if you like eyeshadow palette videos, make sure you give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I would love it if you stuck around. But with all that, let's just get started talking about some palettes. All right, so I know this is not like a new concept here on YouTube. There's quite a few creators who I'll link down below who also do this type of video. So I want to just talk about briefly my thought process when talking about these palettes. The way that I like to do it is I already own these palettes. These palettes are in my collection. I know the formula. I know how much I reach for them. I know just my thoughts on them. And if these palettes magically disappeared from my collection overnight, would I go out and repurchase them? And that's with just in Magic Fairyland that these palettes are all available for purchase. They're not discontinued in my just make-believe world here. I know some people like to talk about whether, if they were a new release, would they still be interested in those palettes? But that is how I like to do it. And just to do an extra spin, I like to pull the 10 palettes that I'm going to talk about randomly. I just pull up my Tiny Decisions app and I have the wheel pick them out for me. So without any further ado, we're just going to get started. I'm going to pull up my wheel here. All the ones in black are palettes that we've already talked about. So I will link the playlist up above and down below if you want to go check out any other videos that I've done talking about some older palettes. Sometimes they're newer, but for the most part, these are all old palettes in my collection. And let's just get started because this is my favorite part, is pulling the palettes and seeing which ones I get to talk about. The first one is going to be the Natasha Denona Mini Love. I always get some Natasha Denona because I have quite a few. Then we have the Charlotte Tilbury Pillowtalk, an iconic palette. Next up is the Lisa Eldridge Muse. I've been wondering when some Lisa Eldridge was going to be pulled because I don't think I've talked about any of them yet. Then we have Pat McGrath Bordeaux Bliss, palette number 5. Natasha Denona Gold. Chanel Tweed Brun et Rose. Lisa Eldridge Vega, okay, to Lisa Eldridge. Lisa Eldridge Sorcery, 3 Lisa Eldridge, I don't know. And not that random, huh? Charlotte Tilbury Fire Rose. Okay, we have 2 Charlotte Tilbury as well. And then I need one more palette. And that is going to be Natasha Denona Xenon, a newer palette. All right, so that is all 10 palettes. I'm gonna go find those, pull those out, and we're gonna talk about them. All right, I have all 10 palettes in front of me. The viewfinder, I'm looking like very yellow, very warm. I'm hoping that doesn't translate when I edit, but that's just a side note. Let's just get started anyways. I have 3 Natasha Denonas, 3 Lisa Eldridge, but the first one, we're just gonna go in the order that they were pulled and generated. The first one that I have is the Natasha Denona Love palette. I do also own the full-size Love, and I don't love that palette. I do love this one though. I think that the midi Love one is just a little too big for me, and it's a little too monochromatic, without having any sort of variation. This palette is small, it's mini, it gives me the same idea as the Love palette, but in smaller form, and I just like this one so much better. I really have, just like these past few months, starting a low buy, really been trying to decide on my goals with my collection, and Natasha Denona is one that I've been giving a lot of thought to on just which ones I want to keep, which ones I want to declutter. And I am considering decluttering the Love and keeping the mini Love, just because I don't know if I need both, and I would rather keep this one. So this is one that I would repurchase. I like the size of it, and I like the color story for Natasha Denona. Like, I don't have a lot of just really pinky palettes, so this does serve a purpose for me, and I do quite like this one. So I would keep it around. I would repurchase it, and that kind of surprises even me because I wasn't really thinking that going into this, but I would repurchase this. All right, next up we have Charlotte Tilbury Pillowtalk, an iconic palette. I'm kind of realizing now, looking at my desk, that these are all luxury palettes. That's the way the cards fall sometimes, I guess, but here's what this one looks like. I think we've all seen this palette. And, you know, I've had quite a few Charlotte Tilbury quads come up in these episodes. I think these are actually, in today's episodes, we'll be done with Charlotte Tilbury. This is all the Charlotte Tilbury that I own. I like this palette. I do. It's a simple look. It's a one look. It's a one and done. Like, there's not much variety that you're going to get out of this quad, but I do like this palette. I'm just deciding, like, would I want to spend $56 on it or however much these quads go for? No, I don't, but I do really enjoy having this in my collection. And I think that I would repurchase it, just not at full price. Not at full price, because now I'm like a lot more of a frugal person. Like, now I actually care. Like, before I used to just like spend money regardless of the price on makeup because I loved it so much. And now I guess, like, when I put how much this quad is in comparison to other things, I've just grown up a little bit, I guess I could say. Like, you know, now I'm in my mid 30s, whereas like before my mid 20s, I was like, money will come. And now I'm like, will it? So I would not pay full price for this, but I would repurchase this palette on like a Black Friday sale or even the 20% off at Sephora, something like that. But I do enjoy having this palette in my collection, and that's the first Charlotte Tilbury quad that I've said that about. So I think that says something. And then next up we have the first of the 3 Lisa Eldridge palettes. So the first one that got pulled is the Muse palette. I did dedicated videos on all of these. I'll link them down below when they first launched. I was really excited for these little 6-pan palettes from Lisa Eldridge. She has just amazing makeup products. But this has been my last. No, it has not. I bought the Velveteens. This has been one of the things that kind of turned me off from Lisa Eldridge. I didn't love these as much as I was wanting to love them. They were quite expensive for 6 pans. I do like, you can take the pans out, you can rearrange them, you can buy them as singles. I think that is huge. If you don't want a palette, you can just purchase 1 or 2 singles if you don't like the color story, etc. So I do love that Lisa Eldridge does that. The Muse palette, though, because we have other ones to talk about, I would not repurchase. This color story is too redundant, quite honestly, in my collection. I have these pinky tones. I don't find it that special. She has a lot of different formulas in the variety of her palettes. Not every palette has every single formula. This has all 3 of the mattes are the velvet formula, which is not my favorite. It's kind of like her cream to matte formula, and or cream to powder formula. I just don't love them on the eyes. They swatch really beautifully. They are very creamy, but I find them a little bit hard to work with on the actual eyelids. So Muse is not one that I would repurchase. However, 10 out of 10 for packaging, like just the execution and the actual formula was not there for me. Now this palette is a little bit newer to my collection. I had this in my speed reviews that I recently did, my last eyeshadow palette ranking video. This is Pat McGrath's eyeshadow palette in Bordeaux Bliss, one of her quints that she came out with for holiday. Here's what this one looks like. If you saw that video, again, it'll be linked down below. I did not rank this the highest, and I said I could live without this palette, and I could. So I would not repurchase this. It's a good formula. Does this one have all shimmers? Yes. This is one of the ones that these are all shimmers. They are really nice formula, really nice quality. But with Pat McGrath, I do have to be a little bit more picky because a lot of things from her collection as a whole now are very redundant. And I've been saying that a lot because Pat McGrath gets pulled in a lot of my videos. I have a lot of Natasha Denona. I have a lot of Pat McGrath. So it's pretty common to see a Pat McGrath or Natasha Denona in each one of these episodes. So I feel like I repeat myself a lot, but that's just the facts. And while like on its own, it's pretty as far as Pat McGrath, like it's just not unique. I have other things. And when she comes out with the same kind of color story over and over, it's hard for a palette to stay in my head as like a unique palette that I want to reach for because it all kind of just like meshes together. It blurs together and I can't remember each individual one. So not my favorite. Like a good formula, recommend the formula. Like if this is your colors, you don't own a lot of Pat McGrath, and you know, get this palette. It's not that expensive for Pat McGrath. It's a nice little quint. I like it just for me and my collection, like not worth having, and a little bit of a regret if I'm going to be honest. Now the next Natasha Denona palette I have is the ever so reflective Natasha Denona Gold. This is actually one of my latest Natasha Denona purchases because it was on my wish list forever, but this was back when Natasha Denona did these like bigger palettes that were $129, $120, something like that. This is what this palette looks like. So at the time, like I just could not justify the price point for this palette. And then I heard that they were discontinuing this palette, as well as the Lila palette. And so I finally picked up both because they'd been on my wish list for so long and I didn't want to miss out. I am so happy I picked up this palette. This is one of my favorite Natasha Denona palettes. It doesn't look that special. Like it does kind of look like 50 Shades of Brown. It is special. I love the browns in here. I love the golds in here. I love the two teals. I don't really wear blue teal that often, but it's only 2 shades, so it's fine. I do wish and I hope that Natasha Denona kind of just gets rid of this format and just goes with the MIDI palettes go forward, because it would be really nice to replace this with the MIDI, but it's fine. I have this one. Like, am I going to finish this palette up? Absolutely not. Really happy that I purchased it. This shade here is kind of like a iridescent, just shimmery, glittery topper shade that transforms any look. You get the best looks out of this palette. When I did my Natasha Denona ranking video, ranking all my palettes, I did not own this palette yet, so this wasn't included. However, if I was to redo that video, this would rank very, very high, like top 5, top 3. Top 3, I'm not sure. Right now there's too much pressure to rank them just right off the bat, but I could say that this would rank very, very high, and I love every time I pull this out. It's a really great palette. I would repurchase it. I'm glad that I was able to before they discontinued it. All right, we're halfway through the palettes. We have a few small palettes. The next one that I pulled was the Chanel Tweed Brun et Rose. I'm going to keep this one super short and sweet. This is my favorite Chanel collection that came out to date. I think it was phenomenal. I purchased 3 of the 4. One of them was just too coppery iron warm tone for me, so I skipped it. This palette had me wanting to buy a backup, but it was already sold out before I could. This palette I wore on my wedding day. Like, I love this palette. It is so beautiful and it really is something. It is not typical Chanel quality. The just formula in here is so smooth, so blendable. It is kind of like that cream to powder finish and very close to the YSL Stora Dolls. This just kind of gives a little bit more of a shimmery look, whereas the YSL is a little bit lighter and sophisticated. This is a little bit more elevated. I absolutely love this palette with every fiber in me. I do kind of wish that I had a backup of this. I was just like pristine, because I will use this and destroy the embossing, destroy everything. Like, I love it too much to just have it sit unused in my collection for collection purposes. 100% no regrets, would repurchase, and would repurchase a double if it was still around. So I love this palette so, so much, and I could never ever get rid of it, declutter it, anything like that. I love the little pouch it came in with the tweed. It's one of my most prized makeup possessions. All right, so the 7 and 8 spot both were Lisa Eldridge palettes, so I'm gonna try and make this brief while not repeating myself on everything I said about the Muse palette, because that does still stand. The first one was the Vega palette that was pulled, which looks like this. And then number 8 was the Sorcery palette, which looks like this. These two palettes are my favorite. There were 5 palettes that released. These two palettes are my 2 favorite palettes from Lisa Eldridge. I would repurchase both. Now, I do like the Sorcery more than the Vega, but that's only because I don't necessarily love all the shades in here. I could really do without. If this was a different shade, I would like it more. Even another matte, because there's only 2 shimmers in here, but more of like a brown cool tone leaning matte, I think I would like it more. So that's why this one gets bumped down to number 2. As just for like an everyday, because I'm kind of like being hypocritical because this only has 1 matte and the rest are shimmers. But there's something about this, like it's like 95% there and Sorcery's 100% there. So do really like this one, would repurchase it out of the 5 that I purchased from Lisa Eldridge. And I would also repurchase this one. I believe that this is the most unique Lisa Eldridge palette. I believe this is also the most popular Lisa Eldridge palette. If I was going to recommend any of them, it would be this one. This one stands out as being a special palette, and the shimmers are so much better than the mattes. Like I said in the Muse, the Velvet matte formula is not my favorite. I don't mind a creamy matte. I like them in Natasha Denona. They just don't work well for me. I find them very hard to use. So because this only has 1 matte and it's a seamless matte, the other matte formula, which is a little bit more dry, this palette is much easier to use, and the shimmers are just stunning. I haven't really been swatching any shades, but like this is the green and this is the blue. They are really pretty. I think about this palette. I remember this palette in my collection, and I want to reach for this palette. It's actually been on my list to pull this into a Shop My Stash for quite some time now. I need to get around to doing that. But it tells me something, like when a palette is memorable to me, because I have a lot of palettes and I don't remember them all off the top of my head. Sorcery sticks out, so I definitely would repurchase that one. And then we have 2 more to talk about before I let you go. So the next one is another Charlotte Tilbury quad. The last Charlotte Tilbury quad that I have to talk about. We've talked about all the ones in my collection, but this is actually the newest quad to me, and this is Fire Rose. I also talked about this in my speed review along with the Pat McGrath Quint, but this is what this looks like. This was released quite a long time ago from Charlotte Tilbury. It sold out very, very quickly. She said it was limited edition. I've said this story, but I missed out on it. I wanted it so bad. It took everything in my power to not buy it on a resale price for double, triple the price. I waited it out, and I'm so glad that I did, and I'm so glad that she brought it back. I jumped on it immediately. So I'm very happy to have this. This is one I would repurchase. Same with Pillowtalk, because this is a palette that I always thought about. You know, I wasn't able to buy it, and I thought about this palette often. So it tells me that it's a palette that I'll actually use. Like I said, it's a little bit newer in my collection, so I can't tell you how much I organically reach for this palette. But considering the fact that it was a palette I really thought about and was really the palette that got away, so to say, from me, I would repurchase it because I did. I mean, I missed out on it and I wanted it so bad that when it finally released years later, like we're not talking 6 months, like I think it's been at least 2 years or so since that palette was sold out. It tells me like, it's a good one to have in my collection. It's not one that just I impulsively purchased and I don't really get use out of. And then the very last palette that I have to talk about is my third Natasha Denona palette. That is the Xenon palette. This palette was also in my ranking video with the Fire Rose. You know, I probably should not have bought this palette. I did 5 looks with this palette, as well as the I Need a Nude, linked down below. I do see the difference in the tones. I've said that before. I know some people can't really see the different depths with the blues and like the pinks and the taupes. I can see that in this palette. It's just, I should have purchased the mini Xenon over this palette. This was new and shiny. This was the newest palette, so I purchased this one. Whereas, you know, I'm not gonna get the use out of this palette because it's mostly gonna be a complementary palette to me. And the mini Xenon would have been much easier to be a complementary palette because it's smaller. So I would not repurchase this. Happy to have it in my collection. The shimmers in this are stunning. Like if this is your color story, if you like navy blues, if you like smoky eyes, I will say you can get a lot out of this palette. It's a very deceiving palette. Like how much can you do with black, white, and gray? Natasha Denona showed us that you can do a lot with 15 shades in that color story. Like I will say, while some of these are similar, they are all very different and they all have a different formula. I just think like this is for a very specific person and it's not me. So not a bad palette. I would recommend it if this is your color story, if this is something you get a lot of use out of. I just know I will not. I should have gone with the mini Xenon. Shame on me, but the damage is done. I do like, you know, I'm not going to get rid of it because I can pop the shades out. I can maybe curate a Natasha Denona palette for me with some of these shades in here just as a standalone palette. This is not the best purchase that I've made in a while, and I don't think I would repurchase it. If I had a do-over, I would go and purchase the mini Xenon, I think. But there we have it. That is all 10 palettes for today's episode of Would I Repurchase? You'll have to let me know down below, do you own any of these palettes? Do we have the same thoughts and opinions, or are they different? I would love to just chat down below in the comments section. Were any of these on your wish list that maybe you want to pick up and you just haven't yet? Did you purchase the Chanel Tweed? Because if you didn't and like you can't now, I do kind of feel bad. Like if you wanted it, of course, but it's a really good palette. That's one of my favorite palettes ever, I think you can tell. But that's all that I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're having a great one, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.